El gobierno de Estados Unidos reduce el financiamiento a principales medios de comunicación, lo que significa. Explora la impactante decisión del gobierno de Estados Unidos de desfinanciar a los principales medios de comunicación y sus implicaciones globales.
Wow, sometimes in the world of global news, things happen that really shake things up.
Yeah.
And today, we're looking at a pretty big one. The U.S. government just pulled funding from some huge international news outlets. We're talking Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, like some really big names.
Yeah, definitely a move that's got a lot of people talking, and not just in the U.S.
Exactly.
So what we want to do today is unpack this a bit. Like, what's the reasoning behind this decision? What are we seeing happen on the ground right now? And how are different countries reacting to this?
Yeah, because it's a pretty complex situation, right? We've got a whole stack of articles here from Giselle Ruhi-Ewing, Ketrin Yochikova, Reuters, Aaron Hale, and RFI. Each one kind of gives us a different angle.
Absolutely.
But our mission today is to cut through all the noise and give you a clear picture of what's going on, why it matters, without getting bogged down in all the tiny details.
Right.
So to kick things off, let's start with the why. What exactly did the U.S. government do, and what was the reasoning behind it?
So it all seems to stem from an executive order that President Trump issued last Friday. Basically, it calls for eliminating what they call non-statutory components from different government entities. And one of those entities was the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which you'll often hear referred to as USAGM.
USAGM.
Right.
Okay.
And then, really quickly, on Saturday, USAGM comes out and says they're immediately terminating the grants that fund these news organizations, VOA, RARL, and RFA.
So it sounds like the Trump administration is, framing this as a cost-cutting measure,
Yeah.
trying to streamline the government. We've even seen people like Elon Musk chime in saying, these outlets are wasting taxpayer dollars and maybe not really serving U.S. interests.
Uh-huh.
And then you have the White House coming out and saying these cuts make sure that taxpayers are no longer on the hook for radical propaganda.
Right, which is a pretty loaded statement.
Yeah, it definitely suggests a very particular view of these organizations.
It does. And it's important to point out that not everyone shares that view.
Right.
Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. They didn't just sit back. They actually filed a lawsuit against USAGM and two specific officials, Kari Lake and Victor Morales. Their argument is that funding these operations isn't some optional thing. It's actually a legal requirement of USAGM. It's written into law.
So they're saying it's not just a policy disagreement, but an actual legal violation?
Exactly. They argue that Congress specifically allocated these funds, and the International Broadcasting Act, which is the law governing all this, mandates that this money be given out through grants. So by refusing to hand over the money, RRL is saying USAGM is breaking the law.
So they're not backing down at all?
Not one bit. Stephen Capus, who's the president and CEO of RRL, called the grant termination a massive gift to America's enemies. Said they're going to fight this tooth and nail.
So let's talk about the immediate fallout of this decision. What's happened on the ground since these announcements were made?
Well, the very same day, Saturday, Voice of America placed over 1,300 of its employees on leave.
Oh my gosh.
That's a huge number of people, and it really indicates that VOA might not be able to function much longer.
Yeah, that sounds like a potentially fatal blow.
It really does. And it's not just VOA. This move basically means the likely end for Radio Free, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, the Middle East Broadcasting Network, and the Open Technology Fund, all these entities that fall under USAGM.
So we're looking at a significant dismantling of this whole network of international broadcasters. And I imagine this hasn't gone unnoticed by some countries that have had let's say, a contentious relationship with these outlets in the past.
Absolutely.
Particularly China and Russia.
You hit the nail on the head. Both countries have been pretty open about their, let's say, satisfaction with this turn of events. It's worth noting that back in 2017, both China and Russia designated RARL and VOA as foreign agents.
Right.
So they clearly viewed them as influential and, well, maybe not in a way they liked.
So how have they reacted now?
Pretty bluntly, actually. Margarita Simonian, who's the editor-in-chief of Russia's state-run broadcaster, RT, she actually called Trump's decision a holiday for her team.
Oh, wow.
She even said, we couldn't shut them down, unfortunately, but America did so itself. So you can really sense the lack of sadness on her part.
Yeah, it sounds like they feel like they've won something.
It does. And Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, he kind of doubled down on that, calling these outlets purely propagandistic and saying it's really an internal U.S. matter. like not something they're going to lose sleep over.
So it seems like they feel like a thorn in their side has been removed.
Definitely. And the Moscow Times actually reported that some current and former Kremlin officials felt these outlets were actively trying to sow discord and damage the Kremlin's image,
Yeah.
especially in those post-Soviet states.
I see. So they felt threatened by their influence.
Absolutely. And the reaction from China has been just as, let's say, celebratory.
Yeah, I was going to say, I bet they haven't been holding back either.
Not at all.
Yeah.
The Global Times, which is a state-affiliated media outlet in China called VOA, a lie factory, that's been discarded by its own government like a dirty rag.
Wow.
They even said that almost every malicious falsehood about China has VOA's fingerprints all over it,
Yeah.
which, ignores VOA's work on, say, reporting on human rights issues and countering disinformation. And then you have a columnist from the Beijing Daily saying VOA has been notorious for spreading lies and that the world is waking up.
So you have this really stark contrast. On one hand, you have China and Russia essentially celebrating this move.
Right.
And then on the other hand, you have a lot of concern and criticism being voiced.
Absolutely.
A lot of U.S. lawmakers and human rights advocates are pretty alarmed by this whole thing. They're saying it's a huge blow to what they call America's soft power, which is basically the ability to influence through, attraction and persuasion rather than force.
Right.
And they're worried that this move basically gives a free pass to countries like China, which have been, really expanding their own global media presence.
Exactly. And that point about China's growing influence is a key one.
Yeah.
Like you have Raja Krishnamurthy, who's the top Democrat on the House Select Committee on China, and he said the only people cheering for this are adversaries and authoritarians around the world.
That sums it up pretty well, doesn't it?
It really does.
Like, that's the core of the concern right there.
Yeah, and it's not just Democrats who are worried about this.
Oh, right. Okay.
You also have Republicans like Young Kim, who chairs the House Select Committee on East Asia and Pacific, and Michael McCaul, who used to chair the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. They've also spoken out against these cuts, especially when it comes to Radio Free Asia.
Okay.
They say these outlets are crucial for pushing back against authoritarian regimes, promoting freedom and democracy, and cutting their funding just weakens America's position on the world stage.
So there's bipartisan concern about this, and it's not just coming from within the U.S. either, right? We've seen reactions from international organizations and other governments too.
Oh, absolutely. The EU put out a statement saying this decision risks benefiting our common adversaries.
Yeah.
And they highlighted how important a free press is for democracies to function properly.
Right.
And then you have Jan Lipovsky, who's the Czech foreign minister. He made a really powerful statement. He said, these outlets remain among the few free sources of information for those living in oppression. And he's even looking into ways to keep R4L running.
Wow.
Like, that really shows how much some countries value these organizations.
Yeah, it really underscores the importance of what they do.
Absolutely. And it's not just governments either. The parent company of RFI, which is France Médias Monde, they got together with Germany's Deutsche Welle and released a joint statement. They said they were really worried because this move could cut off millions of people from what they called a vital source of balanced and verified information.
It's easy to forget, when you're reading these headlines, that we're not just talking about abstract organizations here.
Right.
We're talking about real people who rely on this information, in their daily lives. Absolutely.
And the articles we read really drove that point home, didn't they? Like, we heard from journalists and activists in places like Myanmar, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, who depended on these broadcasts, especially during times of crisis when their own media was censored or unreliable.
Yeah.
Like, there was this one quote from a Burmese journalist who said that when VOA started broadcasting during the 2021 coup, it felt like a light had been switched on.
Right.
It really shows you that for some people, these broadcasts aren't just news, they're like a lifeline.
They really are.
Providing access to information that they wouldn't otherwise have.
Absolutely. And we heard from Chinese democracy activist Gao Yu, who was really heartbroken by this news. She pointed out that the Chinese authorities were genuinely afraid of VOA and RFA. And Uyghur activist Raihan Assat said that cutting funds to RFA would be devastating to the Uyghur cause and basically a gift to their oppressors. She emphasized how important RFA has been in documenting the abuses against the Uyghur people. Right. And when you hear those stories, it really makes you think about the history of these organizations, Like, Voice of America was founded during World War II to counter Nazi propaganda.
Right.
And then Radio Free Europe came about during the Cold War to broadcast uncensored news into the Soviet bloc.
To get information past the Iron Curtain.
Exactly. And Radio Free Asia, they were founded in 1996 with a similar mission, but focused on China.
Yeah.
So their whole purpose from the very beginning has been to provide independent news in places where freedom of the press is really restricted. VOA eventually grew to broadcast in over 40 languages, reaching this massive global audience. And RFA built up this whole network of on-the-ground contacts, allowing them to report on really sensitive regions.
Absolutely.
Now, it's important to acknowledge that these outlets haven't been without their critics, right?
Yeah.
Like, the articles mentioned some past concerns about journalistic standards and inconsistencies, particularly within VOA's different language services.
Right. There were some issues raised. Like, there was a quote from a former VOA journalist back in 2013 who talked about how the quality of journalism could vary a lot between different language desks. And then in 2025, another former VOA journalist expressed concern about what they saw as a lack of professionalism and neutrality in some departments.
Yeah.
So it's a reminder that even these big, well-established media organizations can have their internal struggles and face criticism.
Right.
It's important to keep that in mind.
Okay, so let's take a step back and try to summarize what we've learned. We have this situation where the U.S. government has decided to defund these long-standing international news organizations. And the main reason they're giving is like fiscal responsibility and making sure these outlets align with current U.S. interests.
Right.
But that decision has triggered a lot of reactions, both positive and negative.
Definitely. Like, you have Russia and China basically celebrating this move as a win for them. And then you have U.S. lawmakers, international organizations like the EU, human rights advocates, and most importantly, journalists and audiences in countries where these outlets were a vital source of information, all expressing concern and criticism.
Right. So the future of these media outlets is really up in the air right now.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say what the long-term impact will be on the global information landscape. But it definitely raises some important questions, doesn't it?
It really does.
Like, if you think about the history and the original mission of VOA, RFE, and RFA, what does their potential disappearance tell us about the state of the world today? You know, the struggle for information and influence.
Right.
And what responsibility do different countries and organizations have in ensuring that people around the world have access to reliable news? Like, who gets to tell their story and who gets to hear it?
Yeah.
Those are really important questions that we all need to think about.
Definitely.
So thanks for diving into this with us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
It's a complex issue, but hopefully we've shed some light on it for you.
Yeah.
And, as always, stay informed, stay curious.